Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into some of the most pivotal moments in American history. We often see protests on the news, but do they actually work? Can marching in the streets really change the laws of the land? The answer is a resounding yes. History is filled with examples of ordinary people standing up, speaking out, and forcing the hand of power. From civil rights to labor, and from student movements to environmental crusades, protests have been the engine of progress in the United States. So today, we're going to explore 5 times that protests didn't just make headlines, they rewrote the rulebook and changed U.S. laws forever. These are stories of courage, persistence, and the undeniable power of the people. Let's get into it. Our first story takes us to the early 20th century, a time when women were fighting for a right we now consider fundamental: the right to vote. The women's suffrage movement wasn't a single event but a decades-long struggle. Think about that, generations of women dedicating their lives to this cause. But let's focus on a key moment: the Silent Sentinels. Starting in 1917, led by figures like Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, these brave women stood outside the White House, day after day, in silent protest. They held banners with pointed questions for President Woodrow Wilson, like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Their protest was peaceful, but the response was not. They were arrested, harassed, and imprisoned. In jail, they staged hunger strikes and endured brutal force feedings. This wasn't just a protest. It was an act of extreme sacrifice. The public, initially indifferent or even hostile, was horrified by the reports of their treatment. The contrast between their peaceful defiance and the government's violent response created a massive shift in public opinion. It became impossible to ignore the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it to half the population at home. The pressure became immense. President Wilson, who had previously been lukewarm on the issue, finally announced his support for the suffrage amendment. The relentless pressure from the Silent Sentinels and the wider suffrage movement directly led to the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote. It's a powerful lesson. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made without saying a word. Next, let's jump forward to the Great Depression in the 1930s. The economy had collapsed, and millions were unemployed. World War I veterans had been promised a bonus for their service, but it wasn't due until 1945. For many, 1945 might as well have been a century away. They needed help now. In 1932, an estimated 17,000 veterans and their families, calling themselves the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C. They set up Hooverville's shantytowns near the Capitol and demanded the early payment of their bonuses. For months, they camped out, a visible and persistent reminder of the government's broken promises. President Herbert Hoover, however, saw them as a threat. He refused their demands and, in a decision that would forever tarnish his legacy, ordered the U.S. Army to evict them. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the military used tanks and tear gas to drive out the unarmed veterans and burn their camps to the ground. The images were shocking: American soldiers attacking their own veterans. The public was outraged. The incident contributed heavily to Hoover's landslide defeat in the presidential election later that year. His successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, handled things differently. While the bonus still wasn't paid immediately, the political landscape had fundamentally changed. The public outcry and the veterans' determination kept the issue alive. In 1936, over President Roosevelt's veto, Congress finally passed a bill to pay the bonus. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy of the Bonus Army's protest led directly to the creation of one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history: the GI Bill of 1944. Lawmakers, wanting to avoid a repeat of the Bonus Army fiasco after World War II, created this comprehensive benefits package, providing veterans with education, low-cost mortgages, and unemployment insurance. The GI Bill reshaped America's middle class and its economy, all thanks to a group of desperate veterans who refused to be forgotten. Of course, no discussion of protests changing laws is complete without the civil rights movement. It's a vast, complex story, but let's zoom in on a specific campaign: the Selma to Montgomery Marches of 1965. By this time, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had passed, but in many parts of the South, African Americans were still systematically denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Selma, Alabama, was a flashpoint. Activists, led by organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, decided to stage a 54-mile march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, to demand fair voting rights. On March 7, 1965, a day that would become known as Bloody Sunday, about 600 peaceful marchers were brutally attacked by state troopers and local police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They were beaten with clubs and gassed, all in front of television cameras. The nation watched in horror. The raw brutality, broadcast into living rooms across America, was a moral catastrophe for the country. It was impossible to ignore the violent reality of voter suppression. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. led a second symbolic march to the bridge. The outcry was so immense and so immediate that President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been hesitant to push for more legislation, knew he had to act. Just 8 days after Bloody Sunday, he addressed a joint session of Congress, calling for a strong federal voting rights law. Quoting the movement's own anthem, he declared, "We shall overcome." 5 months later, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. This monumental act outlawed discriminatory voting practices and was a direct result of the courage of the marchers in Selma and the power of their protest to expose injustice to the world. Let's shift gears to a different kind of movement, one for the planet. By the late 1960s, the environmental consequences of industrial pollution were becoming frighteningly visible. Rivers were catching fire, cities were choked with smog, and species were disappearing. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, after witnessing a massive oil spill, had an idea. What if we could harness the energy of the student anti-war movement and channel it into environmental awareness? The result was the first Earth Day on April 22, 1970. This wasn't a march on Washington. It was a nationwide grassroots protest and educational event. An astonishing 20 million Americans, 10% of the entire population at the time, participated. From coast to coast, people took to the streets, parks, and auditoriums to demand a cleaner, safer environment. It was one of the largest single-day protests in human history. Crucially, it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats, rich and poor, city dwellers and farmers. Everyone came together. The political impact was immediate and staggering. Washington, which had been slow to act on environmental issues, was jolted into action. The sheer scale of the protest demonstrated a huge untapped voter base that cared deeply about the environment. This public pressure led to a wave of landmark environmental laws. In December of 1970, President Richard Nixon, a Republican, established the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. In the years immediately following, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. These laws form the very bedrock of environmental protection in the U.S. today, and they were born from the overwhelming public demand demonstrated on that very first Earth Day. Finally, let's talk about the power of student activism. The late 1960s were a time of turmoil, with the Vietnam War as a major focal point of protest. But there was another issue galvanizing young people: the draft. At the time, you could be drafted into the military at age 18. But in most states, you couldn't vote until you were 21. The slogan, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," became a powerful rallying cry. Young men were being sent to fight and possibly die in a war they had no democratic say in. This contradiction felt deeply unjust, and student protesters across the country made it a central part of their message. They organized marches, sit-ins, and draft card burnings. The argument was simple and morally undeniable. It resonated not just with students, but with a growing number of adults and politicians who recognized the hypocrisy. The constant, vocal pressure from the youth-led protest movement forced Congress to confront the issue. The movement gained momentum, and the argument became mainstream. In 1971, Congress passed the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, lowering the voting age to 18. It was the fastest amendment ever to be ratified in U.S. history. This wasn't a gift from politicians. It was a right won by young people who demanded to be heard. It's a testament to the fact that you don't have to be a seasoned political operative to change the Constitution. Sometimes all it takes is a clear, just cause and the courage to fight for it. So from the silent sentinels to the Earth Day activists, these stories show us that protest is woven into the very fabric of American progress. It's often messy, difficult, and even dangerous, but it is undeniably effective. These 5 examples are just the tip of the iceberg, but they prove that when people organize, and demand change, they can move mountains, topple unjust laws, and even amend the Constitution. It's a reminder that democracy isn't a spectator sport, it requires participation. Thank you so much for watching. What are some other protests that you think changed history? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. We'll see you next time.